Hello, welcome to The Drum. I'm Julia Baird. Coming up, Israel and Hamas call a halt to fighting. The spotlight now falls on US attempts to secure a lasting peace. Machine-made love. Is it possible to achieve real intimacy with a robot? And do we really want them to know our deepest fears and desires? And the BBC admits that a lie sealed the deal on Princess Diana's tell-all interview about her marriage to Prince Charles. And joining me on my Friday night panel, advisor at government advisory firm Council House, former Liberal senior advisor and current party member Luke Naina. Welcome to The Drum.
Thank you.
Good to have you. And GP and City of Sydney councillor Dr Karen Phelps is back again after a busy day in the clinic. Thanks for making time.
Hi, Julia.
In Melbourne, editor at ABC Every Day, Bhakti Puvanathan. Hello, welcome.
Hello.
And also in Melbourne, lawyer and chair of Digital Rights Watch, Lizzie O'Shea. Welcome to you too, Lizzie.
Thanks, Julia.
Good
nice to be
see
here.
you. If you want to join in on Twitter, you just have to use the hashtag The Drum, and we are also streaming on Facebook. Now, when it comes to vaccines, it's becoming increasingly clear that many of us are happy to wait. When asked why, some cite concerns about side effects or say that with COVID, there's no rush. And we know that more than 1.5 million COVID vaccines are presently sitting unused in clinics across the nation. So should we be in a hurry to roll up our sleeves? Well, the experience of Taiwan might just be the cautionary tale Australia needs. Up until just a few weeks ago, the island nation was enjoying an unfettered, almost COVID-free existence. But as The Drum's Eliza Harvey reports, that's all changed.
Taiwan is in the grip of a COVID-19 crisis. In 2020, the island nation closed its borders and recorded just 1,200 cases throughout the entire pandemic. But now, authorities have lost control.
We have 335 new COVID-19 cases today. Among them, 333 are domestic cases and 2 are imported.
Taiwan's borders have been breached by a change in their quarantine program last month. Flight crews were allowed to quarantine at home instead of a hotel for 3 days. A China Airlines pilot tested positive in Australia, and as they ramped up testing, more pilots and their families were also found to have the virus. COVID appears to have spread quickly in a community which had become complacent against the threat. To make matters worse, fewer than 1% of the population of 23.5 million has been vaccinated.
Previously, my intention of getting vaccinated was so-so because I've heard the side effects are severe. But now the pandemic is worsening and people who visit the clinic often cough, so I came for a vaccine.
The race is now on to source more vaccine and eliminate the virus.
I believe that with such a big scale of detection and testing by the local governments, we will be able to contain the outbreak.
Starting tomorrow, all the classes will be suspended in senior high schools, junior high schools, elementary schools and kindergartens.
Taiwan's experience is a warning for Australia. Today, more than 100,000 vaccinations were administered, but thousands of AstraZeneca doses are sitting unused in clinics across Sydney and regional New South Wales as fears of a very rare blood clot syndrome keep people away. The Health Minister, Greg Hunt, was criticised by doctors for these comments yesterday.
Right now, we want to encourage everybody over 50 to be vaccinated as early as possible, but we've been very clear that as supply increases later on in the year, there will be enough vaccine of mRNA vaccines for every Australian.
Since then, though, Mr Hunt has reiterated that the government wants people over 50 to get vaccinated with AstraZeneca without delay.
A cautionary tale from Taiwan there, Karen. You've come straight from your clinic. What is the attitude of people who are coming to you and asking you questions about about the vaccine?
I'm seeing a range of responses. A lot of people are saying as soon as I can get my vaccine, I've signed up and I'll be in there and I'll have the vaccine done. A lot of other people are very confused and they're asking questions about which vaccine for them, in particular people who've got some kind of pre-existing medical condition, and we're generally advising those people to speak to their specialist to get individual advice about which vaccine is best for them and under which circumstances. And some people may be advised in rare instances not to have the vaccine, but the majority of people will be advised to have one or other of the vaccines. At the moment, I think the best thing to do is to go with government advice because it has been produced by experts. But I think we also have to acknowledge that these people who are hesitant are vaccine hesitant. They are not anti-vaxxers. I'm getting people coming in saying, please give me my flu vaccine or please vaccinate my children. They're not anti-vaxxers. They are just well informed. But sometimes a lot of information can become confusing. And I think we're really at a point at the moment where people are really making a risk and benefit analysis for themselves, but also they are thinking about the greater good. They're thinking about, well, the more of us who get vaccinated, the more likely it is that we'll be able to maintain something of a normal lifestyle and protect other people who are vulnerable. And so there are these two levels of decision making that are happening at the moment. And what's happened is that people have become concerned about the risk of clotting with AstraZeneca, but that's not to say there aren't potentially serious side effects with the Pfizer vaccine. We know that with any vaccine and with any medication, there's a potential for side effects, whether it be anaphylaxis or whether it be some other side effect. And you have to weigh that up against the risk of getting COVID virus. Because what I've also seen in the clinic is people returning from overseas who have had COVID in the UK or in the US and they've been terribly sick. And it's frightening to think that we could have that virus circulating in our community. And we do have the opportunity to be vaccinated to protect ourselves from serious disease. And I think this is the message that we need to get across. But people in the end have to make an independent decision for themselves, for their families, but also consider the greater good.
So, but how do you assuage the fears that people have? Because you've said that they're confused, but also there's almost too much information. So how do you address that?
Well, in general practice, we have to stay as up-to-date as possible with all of the reports that are coming in from multiple sources internationally, from our colleagues overseas, from our specialist colleagues here in Australia. And we have to acknowledge the fears of patients because the fears are real. I mean, people are concerned that maybe if they've had, for example, a history of thrombosis in the past, it might not be the type of thrombosis that is causing a concern with the AstraZeneca vaccine, but they are making that connection. So the fears are real and we have to talk people through the detail and acknowledge the fear and address concerns and then people have to have the time and the space to ask their questions and to get the answers that are going to be completely honest. You have to be totally honest with people because you can't just say, oh, you'll be okay, because, you know, some people will get an adverse reaction. It might only last a day or two or a week, but some people will get longer lasting adverse reactions. And so you have to acknowledge that, but you also have to put the risk in perspective of the number of people likely to get an adverse reaction, but also in perspective if somebody has a pre-existing condition that they do get further advice so that they are satisfied that the decision that they are making is in all the circumstances that, you know, and all the information that we have to hand is the right decision for them.
I feel like you've had to say this a lot, not just today, but in the last few days, right? This is a conversation you're probably finding yourself having again and again and again. And I do think it's very helpful for our audience as well to know that because you are up to date with all the latest as it's occurring. Do you think we can be doing a better job on messaging?
I think there's a real challenge for government to shake Australia out of its complacency when it comes to COVID-19, and you only need to look at the comparison around other OECD countries comparatively with Australia. We would have seen an additional 30,000 people having lost their lives as a result of the COVID virus had we not controlled it so successfully. So where does the imperative come from for people to actually go out and get vaccinated? There's a lot of talk around international borders. I'd actually like to see some certainty around domestic borders. I'd like to know I could fly to Perth and not be at risk of being put into lockdown for 2 weeks.
Right.
And that is the timeframes and the narrative that government now needs to look at to give people certainty.
To give people incentives to
absolutely.
do it. You
We
can
need
fly
incentive.
domestically if you have yours by July 10.
Exactly, and they've spoken about passports and apps and other methods to enable that. I'm a low risk. I'm a 33-year-old. I think I'm in phase 2B, which is the last of the rollout. I don't know what that means practically. I don't know when I'm due to get my vaccine. I don't know what that looks like for me being able to travel internationally when the borders reopen. But had I got the opportunity to go out tomorrow and get the vaccine, I would absolutely do it. And if you had said to government a few months ago that the issue would be around demand and not supply, you would have probably been laughed out of the room. So the challenges that government have been forecasting around shoring up that domestic supply, looking to ramp up domestic manufacturing and production, isn't what we're dealing with now. It's a matter of actually encouraging people to get out and get the vaccine, and there just has to be more incentive and clearer messaging. And I think the media in this as well needs to really be mindful of the way in which they're communicating the side effects and the adverse reactions. If you have a look at most vaccines, you're always going to have these instances. I had the flu shot a couple of weeks ago and I'm convinced it gave me man flu for 2 weeks. It's just a side effect of keeping healthy. And for for the media to really remind Australians that we have some of the highest medical standards in the world. The approval system was robust, and at the time we were being criticised for taking too long in approving the vaccine when overseas governments were looking for emergency exemptions and the like. So there should be enough guidance and information out there to help people make a very informed decision.
I'm sorry to hear about the man flu.
It was a shocker. It was a shocker.
All the adverse effects are worse for men.
It was.
Yeah, that's probably proven. Just quickly, you probably want to say when you can get...
I was just going to say, a year ago, we were saying if they develop a vaccine in good time, it'll be a miracle. And now we have the vaccine, and we actually even are looking like we're going to have a multiple of choices about a vaccine and which type. So I think that we have to acknowledge that has been a miracle of medical science. What we also are working on is antiviral therapies, which will come into play as well. But with all of these things, it's a matrix. We also need to keep the public health measures going.
Bhakti, can I bring you in here now? How do you think we can shift attitudes around this, particularly when it comes to, you don't want people to panic or be fearful, but be cognizant of the potential dangers?
Yeah, I think one missing piece here has been connecting what, say, an airline CEO's interests are to our broader interests. And I think that there are a lot of people out there who actually don't travel, who don't actually have a lot of connections overseas, and they see the connection between opening up the borders and the vaccine, and they're not fussed by it. They're quite happy actually with our isolation out here as an island nation and our very effective measures so far. So I think one of the things we need to look at is actually the possibility of a resurgence. And I agree with you, we don't need fear, but that message does probably need to be communicated a bit more, because I do think a lot of people have forgotten how awful, particularly outside of Victoria, states that didn't have the hard lockdown of last year probably just haven't really thought through what it would be like if we had a real third wave, and I'm quite concerned about that. I also saw a great idea on Twitter this afternoon, which was having snags at vaccine centres as a potential incentive. So maybe there are some creative ideas for getting people out there and making it something that you do with a buddy, or it's something that's kind of less intimidating, because it does feel a bit intimidating at the moment. It doesn't feel like it's part of the culture. It doesn't feel like it's something that's celebrated. That we see people getting the jab. We see our politicians and other senior figures getting the jab, but actually, how we embed it in the culture, I think that link hasn't been made yet.
How do we make that link, Lizzie?
Well, I think the responsibility for fixing this particular problem really lies at the feet of the federal government. I don't think they've been running a messaging campaign to anywhere near the degree that they need to. I mean, if you think about their contact tracing app, they promoted the heck out of that and it was a dud. I'm not sure why vaccinations haven't been given the same kind of treatment. And instead what we saw was really dodgy rollout with going to GPs rather than mass vaccination centres, which I think was a mistake, but it was probably done for political reasons because it plays to the LNP base. And then problems with supply that mean it's very confusing to know whether you can get access to the vaccine and whether your appointment will be able to be kept. I think the federal government had kind of one job, really, was to get this right, and they've been doing a pretty bad effort. And the latest comments by Greg Hunt, I think, is just another example of this, where he's kind of giving two messages at once, which is, oh, sure, you need to get vaccinated, but if you want to wait until the end of the year to get a different kind of vaccine, then you can do that, which is just wholly unhelpful. So I think it's a shame that Karen has to go to work every day and offer the same messaging, which really ought to be led by our government, and providing that information and relentlessly making it easy to understand and in people's faces, and encouraging them about the good reasons to get the vaccine, the sense of social responsibility that we've got to make sure that we look after each other. These are things that the federal government could contribute effectively on, and they're just not, and I think that's really disappointing.
Just quickly before we leave this topic, Karen, I've seen some suggestions that the media is being alarmist and is putting too much emphasis on the blood clots, or maybe they shouldn't be reported as much as they're occurring. But I can also imagine if the media didn't report on them and then we later discovered there were all these issues that we hadn't been informed about, people would go wild and the issue of trust would be even further eroded, wouldn't it?
I think people need to be informed. As I say, information is key to being able to... It's not just about convincing people, it's about making sure that people understand that they are making an informed decision.
Equipping them to do that.
They have to be equipped, and the only thing to equip them is realistic, trusted information. And that doesn't mean saying everyone's going to be fine. It's saying, yes, there is a risk of an adverse reaction. Sometimes the adverse reactions are serious. If somebody has, a history of anaphylaxis, for example, they will be observed, and there will be people with the skills to be able to treat the anaphylaxis. It's a matter of drilling down into what people's actual concerns are, and then giving them the information that they need to make that decision. And as I said, sometimes that will mean a second opinion from a specialist who can answer those more specialised questions from somebody with, say, immune compromise, or somebody with a neurological problem, for example.
Can I just, very quickly add, I think there's a real need to take the politics out of the conversation as well. I've seen through social media a lot of graphics being put together saying only 1% of the population now are fully vaccinated. In reality, 100,000 people received jabs yesterday, which was for the first time, if I'm not wrong, that we cracked that six-figure mark. And that should be celebrated by the media.
Well, we know it's been a slow rollout.
It has been a slow rollout, but it's upticking. We're comparatively, compared to New Zealand and a few of our other neighbours, ahead in terms of the number of vaccines delivered. And I just think there's a real social responsibility from politicians of all colours to really promote what is being delivered, as opposed to, picking facts to score political points.
All right, let's move now to the Middle East, where a ceasefire appears to be holding in Gaza, hopefully bringing to an end nearly 11 days of violence. Palestinians poured into the streets of Gaza to celebrate the end of fighting, which came into force at 2 a.m. local time. Gaza health officials say 232 Palestinians, including 65 children, died in the conflict, whilst Israel has reported 12 deaths, 2 children among them. US President Joe Biden welcomed the development, which came after several conversations with Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
The Prime Minister also shared with me his appreciation for the Iron Dome system, which our nations developed together and which has saved lives of countless Israeli citizens, both Arab and Jew. I assured him of my full support to replenish Israel's Iron Dome system to ensure its defenses and security in the future. The United States committed to working with the United Nations, and we remain committed to working with the United Nations and other international stakeholders to provide rapid humanitarian assistance and to marshal international support for the people of Gaza and the Gaza reconstruction efforts. We will do this in full partnership with the Palestinian Authority, not Hamas, Authority, in a manner that does not permit Hamas to simply restock its military arsenal.
It's worth remembering the previous ceasefires have disintegrated in hours, so we'll be watching closely for signs that the truce is holding. For more on this, we're joined in Jerusalem by Middle East correspondent at The Independent, Belle True. Belle, welcome to The Drum.
Thank you for having me.
Now, it's only been a few hours, but how it's holding so far. How's the mood on the ground?
Well, there has been sort of celebrations, actually, on both sides of the border crossing since the ceasefire came into place at 2. It has been quiet. just a few hours before the ceasefire, there was a volley of rockets into Israel, which was making people a little bit nervous that they wouldn't be followed by the Palestinian side. I think it's also interesting that, from the Palestinian side, you have Hamas, but there are other militant groups involved, like Islamic Jihad. They sometimes have in the past acted out on their own. So there was some concern there that they maybe wouldn't follow the ceasefire. But so far, it has been quiet. We've seen scenes, as you showed just there, of celebrations in Gaza by Palestinians. They gathered outside some of the Hamas's military leaders' homes in places like Khan Yunis. We've seen signs here also of celebrations. There was fireworks here in Jerusalem last night, which I believe was people celebrating the end of this conflict, which has been quite extraordinary in terms of the ferocity of airstrikes and rocket barrages. But we'll have to see how this plays out during the day. I think from both sides, they do want this to hold, but there is always that case of someone breaking the ceasefire and it disintegrating into more conflict.
Right, and we know they're notoriously fragile, but what signs will we be looking for that it is holding?
Well, I think, first of all, the most obvious sign is that there are no rockets being fired and no airstrikes being launched. But I think also we'll be looking at the rhetoric from the leaders. At the moment, both sides have claimed victory, essentially. Israelis last night in a statement after their Security Council meeting talked about unprecedented achievements. That was the security establishment speaking. On the other side, Hamas was saying people in the streets literally shouting victory. So as long as both sides see this as a victory for themselves, they can talk to their own population and they can keep their, armed wings quiet, then I think this will hold. I think certainly there is interest on both sides of this hostilities not continuing.
But the hostilities were not just happening, across the borders with rockets, weren't they? It was also happening neighbour to neighbour. It was also happening in the streets. It was somewhat of a different kind of conflict in that sense. How do you think that's going to play out? How do you quell that kind of conflict when it goes to such a local level?
Absolutely. So one of the most extraordinary things about the last 11 days is it hasn't just been about rocket barrages over southern Israel or airstrikes across the Gaza Strip, but there's actually been unprecedented levels of unrest within Israel proper and also the occupied West Bank and Jerusalem. And that has been between basically Palestinians, whether they're Palestinian citizens of Israel or Palestinians in the West Bank, and Jewish Israelis and the police. It's really, this is not just recent, this is years and years of bubbling unrest that has really kind of accumulated with massive clashes in Jerusalem, and that's not going to go away anytime soon. There have been mass arrests over Israel, largely of Arab Israeli citizens. I was speaking to the police chief yesterday. He said over 1,000 people have been arrested. There's also been several people charged. We're expecting to see a slew of more arrests in the West Bank by the Israelis as well. And honestly, that is a problem that Israel is going to have to contend with, even when the rocket launches are silent, because there are grievances from the Arab side and there are, problems between these communities. There are a lot of anger. There's a lot of division. I mean, I've never really felt the streets feel so divided and so violent than right now.
And how is the stance of the US President Joe Biden being reported and viewed locally?
Well, I think, from the Israeli perspective rather than the Palestinian perspective, I think there was a lot of gratitude towards Joe Biden, particularly from the right-wing side here, who supports the conflict in Gaza, because at the very beginning, he talked about Israel's right to defend itself. In fact, the very first statement that was released after a phone call with Netanyahu, he didn't even mention the word ceasefire or truce in that statement. He talked about defending Israel's right to defend itself. That was welcomed by the sort of right-wing, more hawkish side of Israel here, who were keen to continue military operations in Gaza to try and what they call restore deterrence against Hamas. And I think, but that sort of messaging has changed with Joe Biden putting additional pressure on the Israelis and the Palestinians to come to the negotiating table. From the Palestinian side, I think there is a feeling of disappointments. I think they hoped that after Donald Trump was moved from power, Joe Biden might be more interested in peace and more interested in pushing the Israelis to, basically abide by ceasefires or truces or come to some kind of peace deal. So from the civilian population of Palestine, I think they feel that Joe Biden's lack of pushing for a ceasefire early on was quite a worrying indication for them. So I think it's split here, basically.
Belle, I'm just going to bring in the rest of our panel now. And Lizzie, I wanted to ask you how you view that there's somewhat of a shift in US foreign policy when it comes to this conflict.
I mean, it is in the sense that the US has been involved in this particular ceasefire, but they did, as is usually the case, they had to be dragged kicking and screaming into it and did resist that several times through the Security Council. I do think it is significant. I think it takes the sheen off the Biden administration. There was a lot of promise for respect for human rights, but then when that rubber hit the road and we're looking at the violation of the rights of Gazans and Palestinians in the West Bank, that rhetoric didn't hold firm. I think it is really interesting to observe how other groups have responded to this. Human Rights Watch, for example, now call the regime that exists in Greater Palestine an apartheid regime, which I think is an interesting shift. And I think there's a lot of people who, and a lot of Jewish people who live outside of Israel, who are now looking at this conflict and aren't particularly pleased with what's going on. I think the increasing shift towards the right within Israel is causing a lot of consternation. And there's greater support now for Palestinian rights. This ceasefire, I think, will be very fragile because ultimately, until we resolve the conflict generally that underpins this, and while Gazans continue to live in what is essentially an open-air prison, unable to move and oppressed in significant ways, that simmering tension is always going to remain. And so I think it will be interesting to look at how Joe Biden responds, for example, to the question of Jerusalem, what its status is, and whether he'll roll back any of the rhetoric that Trump might have engaged in during his presidency. Yeah. But I think there's a growing movement outside of Israel to support the rights of Palestinians, to end what is increasingly being perceived as an apartheid regime.
Yeah, I just want to get your perspective on that, Belle, and how Israel might view that argument, that there's growing support for Palestine, and in Lizzie's words, she's saying it's seen as an apartheid regime.
Yeah, I think it's actually very interesting, and I would agree with that analysis. I think we've had some high-profile, even celebrities get involved. I think Paris Hilton tweeted about it, which is really unusual. It sort of hit the kind of mainstream celebrity side with people supporting the Palestinians. A lot of people here have actually connected that to the Black Lives Matter movement, saying that that's kind of opened the door for people to maybe consider these kinds of issues in terms of human rights. I think also, as Lizzie mentioned there, the Human Rights Watch report, which said that Israel is committing the crime of apartheid, also made it very hard for people to necessarily just blindly support Israel. That followed two other similar reports by Israeli rights groups that also talked about this being an apartheid regime in place. And I think that's made people open their eyes a little bit to the underlying grievances from Palestinians, both Palestinian citizens of Israel and Palestinians in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, about why they might be uprising or they might be unrest. So I think it definitely has become more mainstream. Celebrities have got involved. People have been horrified by the level of bombardment in Gaza, particularly with the levelling of high-rise buildings, including media offices, and the bombings of homes that have wiped out entire families. I think that's counted against Israel. I mean, certainly the rhetoric from the right wing here in Israel has been that perhaps this hasn't been the best thing for the reputation of Israel. There's been a lot of talk about it maybe being a bit of an embarrassing 11 days for the Israeli authorities. So we'll have to see how this plays out, but certainly there has been more support for the Palestinians.
Karen, can I bring you in here? Because, I mean, even using the very words apartheid regime is very inflammatory to people who support Israel. How do you view the sentiments that are being put?
Well, I think it's very inflammatory, and Israel is a functioning democracy in the Middle East, which makes every effort to protect the rights of all people within Israel. But for anybody to assume that this is going to be an easy solution probably isn't across Middle Eastern politics. And I think that the very important thing that needs to happen now is for there to be an international effort to respect the right of Israeli citizens to live without rockets being lobbed indiscriminately into civilian areas, but also respects the human rights of the Palestinian people. And there's been problems in this part of the world since 1948. Every so often, frustration and anger boil over, and you can't expect a sovereign nation like Israel to just sit back and accept that they are going to have rockets lobbed into their civilian areas and not, respond or retaliate.
Right, Luke, it did take Joe Biden some time before he actually was calling for a ceasefire, as Bella is pointing out. Should he have gone in earlier?
I think on any measure, if this is the first major challenge of President Biden in a foreign affairs sense, he has failed the task. And it goes back beyond the commencement of the conflict a couple of weeks ago. He's talking about quiet diplomacy and the need to do this over time. I think the change in rhetoric from the White House and from President Biden is so dramatic that if it were President Trump changing his tune like that, more of a deal would be made from it. And you need to actually have a look at the environment in which the Middle East has sort of come to post-Trump presidency. The talk around Iran and the nuclear deal being re-entertained by the United States. There's been a seismic shift in the language in terms of Israel, a real downplaying of the strategic importance of Israel in the Middle East, not just to the United States, but here in Australia we should appreciate that they are one of our closest strategic allies. And to go from saying that a sovereign nation has the right to defend itself to then calling on a ceasefire and having to use that quiet diplomacy as it was put is just an inconsistent stance from the president.
I can see Lizzie shaking her head now. We could be talking about this all night tonight. Belle, you do such important work and I know you've got a massive day ahead of you. Thanks so much. We really appreciate your time tonight. Belle True.
Thank you for having me.
Belle True is a Middle East correspondent at The Independent. And you are watching The Drum. With me on the panel, advisor at government advisory firm Council House and former Liberal senior advisor Luke Nainer, GP and City of Sydney councillor Dr Karen Phelps, in Melbourne, editor at ABC Everyday Bhakti Puvanathan, and also in Melbourne, lawyer and chair of Digital Rights Watch Lizzie O'Shea. All right, time for a change of pace now on our Friday night drum. The pandemic has shown us how valuable technology is in keeping us connected, right? Even when we're apart. But as artificial intelligence and robotic technology advances, could it actually replace the needs for human companionship altogether? Like, what about sex robots? Got your attention, right? It's an obvious pathway, but what might be lost in our quest for convenience and rejection of emotional connection with human and animals? What might be lost? Look, it's a theme that Hollywood has been tinkering with for years.
Welcome to the world's first artificially intelligent operating system.
Hi there, how can I help you?
Oh, a secretary. Great.
Not a secretary.
Can you speak Bocce?
Of course I can, sir. It's like a second language to me. I'm a
All right, shut up.
Smile once in a while.
Smile? Want to explain why you were hiding at the crime scene?
I was frightened.
Robots don't feel fear. They don't feel anything.
I do.
Question 1. Do you think I might be switched off because I don't function as well as I'm supposed to?
Eva, it's not up to me.
Why is it up to anyone?
Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
Go back to your room.
Would you like your OS to have a male or female voice?
Female, I guess.
Goodbye.
Now I know I've got a heart, because it's breaking.
All right, look, this future might be closer than you think, as author Rob Brooks explores in his new book, Artificial Intimacy. Who joins us now? Welcome to The Drum, Rob.
Thank you very much for having me, Julia.
Now, I want to get it out of the way first up. Let's talk about sex robots. Now, I know that a lot of people see this as an indictment on, like a lonely world, but you actually see it as possibly a solution for a lonely world. Tell us why.
It's definitely a potential indictment and a possible solution. I'm on the fence with this one. It just really depends on how it plays out. But much as everybody deserves human contact and should have access to friends and, deserves love, we also know that there's an epidemic of loneliness out there, and there are a lot of people who are desperate and who do need more contact. And it is possible that robots or even friends, robotic friends or virtual reality friends, could fill some of that gap and do a great deal of good. And so that's where I come down sort of in favour of the technologies.
And it's not just it's not just robots. You also write in favour of sex work going digital, which is partly what happened over the COVID period. Can you tell us why you think that it could actually make the world less violent if more people were having digital sex?
Sure. So that's the short journey. The long journey really is that...
That's what we're here for, the short journey, Rob.
The history of human sort of progress and peace has been one of what I call a lowering price of sex. So if you think about the sexual revolution, for example, not everything the sexual revolution gave us was perfect or even great. It made things complicated, but nonetheless it made relationships generally safer, generally more mutually beneficial for people who choose to get into them, and people are able to get out of them much more easily than they were sort of pre the sexual revolution, pre the contraceptive pill. The contraceptive pill, for example, is one of the great peacemaking technologies in all of human history. It unshackled sex from reproduction. Reproduction, as any parent knows, is an incredibly costly thing to do. And so that unshackling, I think, is something that's delivered immense benefits. Conservatives, extreme social conservatives, might disagree with me. Happy to debate them about it. But really, on balance, the sexual revolution, contraceptive pill, and all of the changes that came along with it, second and third wave feminism, have delivered immense benefits. And I can see that sex robots, virtual reality sex, virtual sex where people, two real people in different parts of the world can have sex with one another, virtual sex work, all of these types of technologies, which are, just around the corner, I think, could deliver a huge net benefit, further unshackling, love from marriage and, sex from reproduction.
Yes, and you also then talk about, not just sex, but, relationships. Virtual relationships, and you say virtual friends provide connection and digital lovers dam a raging torrent of sexual frustration. So you talk about having a union of the two that could eventually provide targeted intimacy and sexual stimulation for people of all genders and sexualities. Could it come anywhere near a real human relationship?
Well, a lot of us are in human relationships with other humans who turn out during the course of that relationship not to be the person that we thought they were. And so, it's possible for people to fake their way through relationships. It's possible for, abusive people, coercers, people, seductresses, seducers to not quite meet people, in one-on-one relationships on even terms. The information might be asymmetrical, the intentions might be asymmetrical. So if we believe that we're in love with somebody, if we are in love with someone, because I think the only criterion for whether or not you're in love is if you believe that you're in love with them, then why not, if you were to believe that you were in love with a robot or a virtual reality entity or some form of machine, would that be any less real? And I think you could make a very strong argument that, yes, it's obviously less real because the other side can't possibly feel those feelings that you would want them to feel. But can it deliver something like a reasonable facsimile, at least a not quite as nourishing meal, but nonetheless nourishing? That's the possibility that I think we're facing.
I'm just going to bring Lizzie in here now. I know this is something you've thought about deeply, and you've obviously done a lot of work in digital rights. Do you think that this could meet a need that hasn't been met before, or do you have concerns about, placing a lot of our time and technological energy into developing relationships that are not with other human beings?
Well, I think I agree with Rob that it goes in both directions. I think there's great potential here for people who might be isolated in the physical world, unable to find connection, maybe because they live in an isolated place, they can't find, for example, a same-sex relationship in their locality, but they might be able to find someone online in a virtual space. I think there's great potential there to to help people with feelings of loneliness and isolation. I am also worried about who designs some of these automated systems. I'm worried about who designs all automated systems in the context of the digital revolution. So I think we need to think really carefully about who's in the room making design decisions, what the purpose of the system is, what it does, and who's left out. And one of my concerns, I suppose, is one of the great things about falling in love with someone is that there's some spontaneity to it, there's some expansion of your universe, there's surprise, there's perhaps confrontation of things that you might have held to be true which no longer are, in a positive way. And I'm a bit worried that if we engage too much in automated systems for the purposes of finding intimacy, we can lose some of that really important serendipity and the capacity to grow. One of the things I love about humans is that they're somewhat unpredictable and they're interesting and engaging for that reason. So there are some limits, absolutely, to automated forms of intimacy. And I think that's something we do need to think really carefully about when we engage with these systems so that we can get the best out of them and make sure that we're alive to the potential limitations and, if necessary, do things like regulate in respect of them as well. But certainly at least be digitally literate about what these systems are doing and how they might be affecting us and what we might be missing out on.
And can I just add there, Julia? Sorry, jump the gun. Facebook was invented because Mark Zuckerberg wanted to rank how hot women were. Like, the relationship between technology and relationships is like quite an established one at this point. And now we know that Facebook basically is a universe unto itself that we can't control. So I think it's about thinking through all the things that Lizzie's flagging now, because in 20 years, if this is going the way that Rob says it is, that we're not left with the Facebook problem that we have now. I'm also really curious about how consent and how important it is for consent to be part of the way we think about relationships. That whole conversation we've been having all year around teaching boys about consent, teaching girls about consent and what their rights are. What's the motivation for this? Because if it's about bypassing that, then I'm really concerned that, you know, that whole movement will be forgotten or be for naught in this context.
That's a great point. Rob, do you want to respond to that?
Well, those are all absolutely important points, and I think, you know, Lizzie's point about surprise is an enormous point, because who are we going to be if machines start pushing our buttons? The buttons that the machines are pushing now are the ones that, you know, we evolved during what I call the taming of humanity, when we domesticated one another from, you know, fairly violent antisocial apes into highly social, cooperative, loving, parent-investing apes that are, you know, incredibly domesticated, despite some of the evidence you might see on the news. What seems to be happening right now, with particularly with machine learning taking over, you know, processing the data that we leave behind us in our virtual worlds, particularly social media, etc., is that those machines are starting to take over the domestication of humanity. So what if they deliver to us what we want all the time? If they deliver us a calm voice when we're feeling anxious, that's good. But what if we're feeling sadistic? Will they deliver us evidence of somebody's real pain? I don't know. You know, that's the kind of decision that we need to make and the kind of problem we need to get entirely ahead of. What if they
And I see that with AI
away?
already.
Sorry,
I was just going to say, you see that with AI already.
Yes.
Like, I see children who have like a smart home device just kind of shouting at it and saying, do this, do that, because it's fun. But if you extend that out, and what happens to our brains when we think that we have that level of entitlement?
If we're worried about helicopter parents, imagine when those digital parents that are now raising a lot of children are unable to deliver disappointment, or those digital lovers are unable to deliver rejection. How do we then learn to cope with the lessons of rejection and with those very important, you know, human growth things that happen when we're rejected and we have to reevaluate who we are and where we're going and what is love? So, you know, the potential can be, you know, profound. The potential for good could be, you know, profound, but likewise the potential for large-scale domestication of humanity into a direction we don't want is also there.
Right, and something, you know, that's part of this as well is if robots are to meet like emotional needs, we are developing this emotion recognition software along with facial recognition software, and it's only in reading your book I really did not realise how common these emotion recognition systems are. They're used in job hiring, customer insight work, airport security, and even education to see if students are engaged or doing their homework. Lizzie, can I ask you about that? I mean, what are can you give us some examples? What are some of the pitfalls of reading emotions through our faces and some of the biases that might entrench?
Yeah, well, I'd just start by saying I am very troubled by the use of this in education settings where children may not have consented to this. And I think it's a real problem that we experiment with some of these technologies on children who maybe don't have the capacity to say no. And it is often vendor driven in these contexts. You know, companies make these products and sell them into the Department of Education in a particular place. And we need to be really careful about that. But we do know that there are pitfalls. I mean, I think that we do need to be very careful about assuming that a computer can accurately read people's emotions, because I think the jury's still very far out on that. But we have seen examples where it really fails in educational contexts that have high stakes. So there's a pretty interesting story, I think, of a woman in the United States who was African American. She was conducting one of her law exams, I think it was her bar exam, and she was using Proctor technology, so technology to assess that she was sitting there in front of her computer doing her exam. And the facial recognition system could not recognise her skin colour. And so it assumed she wasn't there, and her only option was to take the entire exam, which was a number of hours, under a bright red light that kind of gave her a terrible headache. And so you have this problem where these systems tend to be designed for the average person and the average user. And if you sit outside of that group, maybe because of your skin colour, maybe you're neurodivergent, there's all sorts of other reasons why you might not fit the norm of somebody who this system can read, you're excluded, or the wrong conclusions are drawn about you. And I think it's really a mistake to be forcing this upon people, and students in educational settings are one such example, until we've done the work to either make it work and to allow people to know how it's being used and to have some transparency and accountability like that, or until that happens, not use it at all. Right. And I think that's the kind of questions we need to be asking now.
To think about it,
so that we don't rush headlong into a system that maybe causes harm unexpectedly.
Right, and we think about a way of regulating it, because you're right. I mean, researchers have shown that facial recognition software interpret black faces as having more negative emotions than white faces do. I mean, there's a massive built-in problem right there. We're talking about students. You've got a 5-year-old. Luke, how would you feel about having his emotions read when he was at school?
Call me old-fashioned, but I'm not up for a lot of this stuff. And I've thought back to when I was a student, and whatever issues and challenges you had at school, at least when you left the school ground at the end of the day, you had an escape from school. And one of the things that really troubles me from a mental health perspective for children is the fact that there is no disconnection anymore. Bullying in the schoolyard is now bullying on Facebook.
Totally.
And kids are
and
going
all night
home
long.
All night long.
Yep.
You know, as a parent, you know, my son's not at that age yet, but as a parent, you know, what steps do you have to take to be really mindful and across what's happening in that digital world? And you know, I think there are so many challenges for education, and we're always striving to find new solutions to help lift educational standards and to really assist those students who do have learning difficulties and the such. But there has to be some standard here whereby you know, technology doesn't become the solution for, you know, issues in the classroom or poor teaching standards or a decline in educational success, because it's not necessarily the solution. We've managed to get so far and done so well for so long without this technology, and the rate at which it's transforming. You know, I always thought I was going to be one of those, you know, older people who was pretty masterful with technology, and I had a group of people not that much younger than me trying to explain Bitcoin to me the other night, and it was all over my head. So yeah,
yes,
I'm finding myself falling behind now as well.
Right, it's such is the nature of the beast. Rob, are we being too alarmist here?
No, I don't think so. I think it's always worth thinking through the negative consequences ahead of time, because, you know, these things don't go back in the box when you want them to. I think the big issues for me really are, you know, how top down are we going to be about controlling what people can do, particularly in the privacy of their homes, particularly once you have got, you know, consenting adults involved. And I think that we should not try to be too repressive about the technologies, particularly the more erotic side of the stuff we've been speaking about. But the other thing, and by far the biggest issue, is going to be who owns the data, because the data that the social media platforms and the big sales platforms and the places that serve up your media, like your videos and your music, the data that they have and that they're gathering right now, the data that Pornhub got by going free when people went into lockdown, you know, they got a tremendous amount of user data. Machine learning algorithms are working their way through those data and will be for some time, and who owns the data is going to, you know, basically control all of the wealth. We don't want it to be a situation where you have big monopolies holding control of the data and possibly sharing it with each other, completely preventing both innovation but also the ability of small individuals to fight back.
All right, Rob, it's so many fascinating issues you raised. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Rob Brooks is the author of Artificial Intimacy. The BBC has been forced to apologise to Princes William and Prince Harry over an explosive interview with their mother, Princess Diana, that aired over 25 years ago. An investigation has found that journalist Martin Bashir deceived Diana to win her confidence, faking documents that suggested her staff were being paid to spy on her. The subsequent interview lifted the lid on her turbulent marriage to Prince Charles, revealing affairs and struggles with mental illness.
Around 1986, again according to the biography written by Jonathan Dimbleby about your husband, he says that your husband renewed his relationship with Mrs. Camilla Parker Bowles. Were you aware of that?
Yes, I was. But I wasn't in a position to do anything about it.
Do you think Mrs. Parker Bowles was a factor in the breakdown of your marriage?
Well, there were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded.
2 years later, Princess Diana was killed in a car accident in Paris. Her son, and heir to the throne, the Duke of Cambridge, made this extraordinary statement in response to the BBC's admissions.
It is my view that the deceitful way the interview was obtained substantially influenced what my mother said. The interview was a major contribution to making my parents' relationship worse and has since hurt countless others. It brings indescribable sadness to know that the BBC's failures contributed significantly to her fear, paranoia and isolation that I remember from those final years with her. But what saddens me most is that if the BBC had properly investigated the complaints and concerns first raised in 1995, my mother would have known that she had been deceived. She was failed not just by a rogue reporter, but by leaders at the BBC who looked the other way rather than asking the tough questions.
Karen, shocking behaviour by Martin Bashir and also the BBC. Now, when this interview came out, I mean, you will remember it was like a massive grenade that was lobbed in the lap of the monarchy. And Princess Diana made her story and her viewpoint extremely well known. It was one of those completely unforgettable interviews. Does knowing this change your view of it and of what she said?
Well, hearing what Prince William has to say does make you wonder whether she would have made the same decision to do that interview had she not been misled. I think it's extraordinary that it's taken the BBC 25 years to come clean about what actually preceded this interview and what she was told, which must have been part of her decision-making process, that she thought that there were enemies within her household and that she had to do something to defend herself. I don't think we'll ever really know what her decision-making process was, but I think that this just compounds the grief for Princes William and Harry, and who at such a sensitive age lost their mother, whom they clearly loved and who clearly loved them, and to think that perhaps some of this pain might have been avoidable is just shocking. But I think it is a reminder to all journalists that there are ethics in journalism for a reason, that regardless of how high profile an individual is, Princess Diana or any public figure, that they're people too. They're human beings with frailties, with vulnerabilities, and that it's important to recognise that that those people also have rights as human beings, and just to consider the impact of what any journalist does, or what they print or what they put to air is going to have a very real human impact.
Bhakti, what's your view about this? We're currently going through a revision of so many stories of what happened to famous women in the spotlight in the 1990s. And I did note that when people are talking about this, For example, Diana's brother was saying, "Oh, she was just she was a young girl. She was a young girl, kind of made prey of here." And I do sometimes wonder if some of her own decision-making capacity and some of her own deliberateness is overlooked because she was surrounded by so many manipulative people who are deceiving her.
It's a great question, because when we deal with vulnerable people in our, profession, certainly for me, it's really about as much informed consent as possible. It's about letting them know what the negative impacts might be of the coverage, because we do view them as vulnerable and we don't want to exploit them. But when we're dealing with powerful people, sometimes those notions go out the window. And what we're seeing with so many of these situations from the 90s, if you think about Britney Spears, if you think about Mia Farrow, if you think about someone like Sinead O'Connor, and obviously Diana being probably the largest looming one, we thought of them as having power, and the media and certainly the paparazzi at the time thought, well, these are powerful women, so they can be treated in however way that we want. But then if you take the question of Diana, actually, there's a lot to suggest she was in the vulnerable camp as opposed to the powerful camp. And the power plays, I mean, I'm not a royal expert. I've watched The Crown, but I don't know
you
that
are
much.
then. No, you're all over it. Yeah.
But, is she as powerful as we thought? The things that Martin Bashir did, they were fraud. Like, he wasn't just lying. He was creating bank statements that, forging things. I mean, that's just so far outside of what we want journalists to be doing, what the standards that we have. It's truly shocking.
It is extremely embarrassing. Lizzie, what of the fact that so many people have been saying, and Diana's family and her friends have been saying, there was a direct line between that interview and her death? Is that fair, do you think?
Well, I think that the fact that Martin Bashir went to such lengths and the fraudulent things that he did, that Bhakti was talking about, does highlight that the media did treat her like something to be preyed upon. And I think you can draw a line between that and her untimely death. For me, also, it does suggest that there are potentially journalists out there who behave in the same way to everyday people. I mean, I think there's a lot of untold stories of people who've had a bad experience with the media, perhaps not to this degree, but at least journalists exercising their power over everyday people to get them to tell their story and exploit them, and we don't hear from them. And in fact, they might be publicly shamed and feel really horrible about the whole experience. It doesn't contribute to a better public debate. I mean, the thing that came to mind when I heard this story is, I imagine all these people who have contracted COVID and had their day poured over by journalists and printed about in newspapers on a regular basis, or the poor guy that was accused of having a party when he got a positive COVID test, which turns out wasn't true at all. The casual disregard for people's dignity by journalists is something that has to end. So I'm really pleased that even though it did take 2.5 decades, this has resolved, because Martin Bashir is a very powerful figure in British media. He was promoted and held in high esteem. And it is good that this is a message that then gets sent to other journalists, that if you do this kind of behaviour, you show disrespect for your source, for someone who's sharing their story with you, that you have a responsibility that comes with the immense power that you exercise when you are the go-between for that story being told to the public.
All right, that's all we have time for tonight. I want to thank our panel, Luke Naya, Dr. Karen Phelps, Bhakti Puvanethran and Lizzie O'Shea. I hope you have an excellent evening and a great weekend. We'll see you next week. Good night.